Korev had 6 eyes, and he used every single one of them to watch the human woman walk into the summit chamber on Valith Prime. She moved the way water moves through a cracked dam, controlled but threatening to become something terrible at any moment. And every species in that room felt it in whatever passed for their bones. Her name was Commander Jayla Oren, and she led the 9th Terran Special Operations Group, a unit the galaxy had learned to call the Reapers, in the same hushed tones that children use when they talk about monsters under the bed. Korev was a scribe adjutant, a record keeper for the Galactic Concord, and it was his job to write down everything that happened at this emergency defense summit without adding his own feelings to the record. He was already failing at that. The Concord was an alliance of over 4,000 species spread across a quarter of the galaxy, and for most of its history, it had managed to solve its problems with diplomacy and trade, and the occasional sternly worded transmission. That era was over. The Vrexol Dominion had come boiling out of the outer reach 6 months ago like a nest of insects exposed to sunlight, except these insects were the size of ground vehicles, and they operated with a hive mind that made them fight as one single terrible organism. They had already consumed 2 border species entirely, not conquered, not subjugated but consumed, stripped their worlds bare and moved on like a wildfire with a strategy. Ambassador Tyvelk, the tall insectoid Rithani who chaired the Defense Committee, had called this summit because the Conquered needed a plan, and everyone in the room knew there was really only one species they were all looking at. Humanity had joined the Conquered 40 years ago, and in that time they had earned a reputation that sat somewhere between valuable ally and thing we keep around, because the alternative is having them as an enemy. The Helix War 5 years back had sealed it. When the Neth Communion had tried to annex 3 conquered systems, humanity had deployed its special forces and ended the war in 11 days. 11 days. Korev had read the reports from that conflict, and they had given him nightmares for a month, which was impressive because Paleshi only slept every 3rd day. Commander Oren stood at the center of the chamber now, and she did not raise her voice because she did not need to. "The Reapers can deploy within 72 hours, she said, and her voice carried the flat calm of someone who had long ago made peace with violence as a profession. She activated the holographic display, and Korev watched the faces, or face equivalents, of every delegation in the room as they saw what a Reaper actually was. The soldiers in the display were barely recognizable as the same species that had first stumbled into galactic society 4 decades ago. They had cybernetic implants threaded through their nervous systems that let them react before a threat fully materialized. Not prediction exactly, but something close enough to make no difference when someone was shooting at you. Their bones had been reinforced with a carbon lattice weave that could absorb impacts that would shatter concrete. Chemical regulators in their bloodstream meant they did not feel fear or fatigue or pain unless they chose to, and they almost never chose to. They could go without sleep for 12 days before performance degradation set in. One of them, in a training demonstration, had punched through the side armor of a light transport vehicle with her bare fist. The Dothany delegation, fragile, crystalline beings who communicated through harmonic vibrations, requested that the air filtration system be separated from the human section of the chamber after learning that every breath Oren exhaled contained carbon dioxide, which was a mild toxin to their species. She was literally poisoning the air around her just by being alive, and Korev thought that was perhaps the most perfectly human thing he had ever recorded. Oren outlined the tactical plan with precision that would have impressed a computer: surgical strikes against the Vrexol vanguard, decapitation of their hive signal relay nodes, rapid insertion and extraction using stealth carriers that could slip through sensor nets like shadows through fog. It was elegant and brutal, and every species in the room nodded along because this was what they expected from humanity's finest. This was the sharp end of the blade they had been paying for with trade concessions and territorial compromises for 4 decades. Tyvelk, the Rithani ambassador, asked how many Reapers would be deployed, and Oren said 400. 400 soldiers to face an invasion force. The room did not question this because they had seen what even a dozen Reapers could do during the Helix War, and 400 seemed like the kind of overkill that humans apparently considered, being cautious. Korev noted in his record that the Rithani delegation had positioned themselves as far from Oren as the chamber geometry would allow, a full 10 meters, and that Ambassador Tyvelk's antennae had not stopped trembling since she had entered the room. He noted that the Gelthari observer had excused herself twice to what Korev suspected was a panic response, though the Gelthari called it atmospheric recalibration. He noted that even the Vrenox, a species of apex predators who stood 3 meters tall and considered themselves the most dangerous beings in the Conquered, watched Oren the way prey watches a predator it does not fully understand. Korev closed his official record for the day and opened his personal journal, which was a violation of scribe protocol, but he had decided some things needed to be written down by a person and not just a functionary. "We have seen what humanity's worst can do," he wrote, "and we pray it will be enough." He almost believed it. Then the intelligence report arrived. It came through on an emergency channel that cut through the summit's communication protocols like a knife through silk, and Korev watched the color drain from Commander Oren's face, which was remarkable because he had not believed until that moment that anything could make that woman's expression change. The Vrexel were not sending a vanguard. They were not sending a scouting force or an advance fleet or any of the measured incremental approaches that the Conquered's tactical models had predicted. They were sending the third expansion fleet, the full weight of it, 15,000 warships carrying enough ground forces to swallow a dozen worlds. The room erupted into the kind of controlled panic that diplomats specialize in, which looked like calm discussion, but smelled like fear to anyone with the right senses, and Paleshi had excellent senses. Tyvelk demanded to know if the Reapers could handle a force of that magnitude, and for the first time in the summit, Commander Oren hesitated. It was only a fraction of a second, but Korev caught it with all 6 eyes, and it terrified him more than anything else that had happened that day. "We will need reinforcements," Oren said carefully. "More of your enhanced soldiers," Tyvelk said, and it was not a question. Oren was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that Korev would later identify as the moment everything changed. "We do not have enough Reapers for this," she said, "but we have soldiers, regular Terran military, standard infantry divisions, marines and support units, and we can deploy 40,000 within the week." The room went silent in the particular way that rooms go silent when everyone present is trying to figure out if they just heard something correctly. "Regular," Tyvelk repeated, as if the word was from a language he had not yet learned. "Unaugmented," Oren clarified, "standard human combat personnel." Korev watched the confusion spread through the chamber like ripples in still water, and he realized that most of the species present did not understand what she meant. In the Conquered, if you sent soldiers they were the best you had. There was no second tier, no lesser version. No backup option that was just ordinary people with weapons. The concept of a civilization sending its regular citizens asterisk to fight a war was so alien to the assembled delegates that several of them simply did not process it. Korev processed it. He set down his stylus and stared at the holographic display still showing the superhuman capabilities of the Reapers, and tried to imagine what kind of species produces warriors like that and then says, "But we also have regular ones," as if that was a normal thing to say. He picked up his stylus again, and added one more line to his personal journal. "They are sending more humans, but not the kind we prepared for, and I am no longer certain what we should be more afraid of." Nithra stood on the landing platform of Shelkar VII and watched the troop transports descend through the gray sky like fat metal birds that had forgotten how to be graceful. She was Paleshi, the same species as Scribe Adjutant Korev back on Valith Prime, and like him she had 6 eyes and a small herbivore body, and a deep instinctive terror of humans that she had spent her entire career learning to hide behind professionalism. She was a liaison officer, assigned to coordinate between the alien defenders on Shelkar VII and the incoming human reinforcements, and she had spent the last 3 days preparing herself mentally for the arrival of more super soldiers. She had reviewed every piece of documentation the Conquered had on the Reapers, the cybernetics, the chemical regulators, the bone weave, the zero-sleep capabilities, and she had built herself a set of expectations that she considered reasonable and well-informed. Every single one of those expectations died the moment the first transport's ramp lowered and the humans walked out. They were smaller than the Reapers. That was the first thing she noticed, and it hit her like cold water because she had not imagined that humans came in different sizes of danger. These humans moved differently too, not with the liquid predatory grace of Commander Oren, but with a loose, uneven energy that looked almost careless. One of them was laughing at something another one had said. One of them tripped on the gangway ramp and caught herself, and said a word that Nithra's translator flagged as profanity, mild, humorous context. One of them was carrying a bag that appeared to contain nothing but personal snack items. Nithra opened a secure channel to her command authority and said the words that she would later be embarrassed about but which felt completely justified at the time. They sent the wrong humans. Her superior, a Paleshi colonel named Drevin, asked her to clarify. "These are not enhanced," Nithra said, watching more humans pour out of the transports in a river of green and brown armor. "They have no visible cybernetics, no augmentation scarring, no chemical regulator ports, Colonel. Some of them appear to be asterisk joking with each other." Drevin told her these were what humanity called regular military, and that approximately 40,000 of them would be arriving over the next 12 hours. Nithra asked what regular military meant. Drevin explained that in human civilization there existed a vast spectrum of military capability, and that the special forces represented only the very top of that spectrum, and the rest were composed of ordinary human citizens who had volunteered or been recruited to serve. Nithra stood on the platform and processed this, and felt something she could only describe as the sudden absence of hope. She was assigned to work directly with a unit from the 3rd Terran Marine Division, and this was how she met the 3 humans who would change everything she thought she knew about the species. Corporal Danielle Mwangi was 24 years old, and she had brown skin and short hair, and a smile that appeared at unexpected moments like sunlight through a cracked ceiling. She was from a city called Mombasa on the human homeworld, and she had joined the military because it paid for her younger brother's medical treatment, which Nithra found both touching and horrifying. The idea that a person would enter a profession of violence to heal someone they loved contained a contradiction that made her head hurt. Sergeant First Class Tomás Herrera was 34, and he had a face like weathered stone and a voice that sounded like gravel being poured into a metal container. He had been a soldier for 16 years, not because of any enhancement or compulsion, but simply because he had decided at 18 that this was what he would do with his life, and he had kept doing it through sheer momentum and what he called being too stubborn to file the paperwork to quit. Private Yunseo Park was 20 years old, and he was the youngest member of the squad, and Nithra could see that he was afraid. This was perhaps the most shocking thing of all because Nithra had never seen a human display fear before. The Reapers did not feel it, could not feel it, had been chemically and surgically stripped of the capacity. And yet here was this young human with wide eyes and nervous hands, and a picture of a small furry animal taped inside his helmet that he looked at when he thought no one was watching. "That is a dog," Mwangi told Nithra when she noticed her staring at the picture. "His name is Biscuit. Park loves that dog more than he loves most people, and honestly I respect that." Nithra began her assessment of the human regulars and compiled her findings with increasing alarm. They had no cybernetic enhancements of any kind. Their reaction times were fast by galactic standards, but not the precognitive lightning of the Reapers. They required sleep every single night, not as an optional maintenance cycle, but as a biological necessity, between 6 and 8 hours of complete unconsciousness during which they were functionally helpless. They needed to eat multiple times per day, and their nutritional choices were chaotic at best. Nithra watched Herrera apply a red liquid to his ration pack, and when she scanned it, her equipment identified it as capsaicin, a chemical compound that caused pain responses in human tissue. "Are you medicating yourself?" she asked him. "It is hot sauce," Herrera said, "and yes." They experienced a full range of emotions at all times with no chemical regulation. They could be angry and then sad, and then laughing within the span of minutes, and Nithra found this so destabilizing to observe that she had to excuse herself twice to recalibrate her own stress responses. Mwangi seemed to understand that Nithra was struggling, and she sat down beside her one evening, while the humans were setting up their forward positions alongside the Paleshi Defense Militia. "You were expecting Reapers," Mwangi said. "Yes," Nithra admitted. "And you got us instead." "Yes." Mwangi was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "We are not the Reapers. We are not augmented or enhanced or engineered. We are just people, Nithra, and I know that is probably not what you wanted to hear right now." Nithra looked at this unaugmented human who slept every night and felt fear and ate food that caused her pain for recreational purposes, and who had crossed the galaxy to fight a war because her brother needed medicine. "I do not understand your species," Nithra said. "That is okay," Mwangi said. "Most of the time we do not understand ourselves either." Nithra filed her report that night, and she chose her words carefully, because she knew it would be read by every senior officer in the Concord defense structure. "The Galactic Concord pinned its survival on humanity's warriors," she wrote, "and humanity has sent us its citizens. I am attempting to reconcile this with our strategic requirements. I do not understand the distinction humanity makes between those who are built for war and those who simply choose to participate in it. I am trying not to despair." She reviewed the report and added a final line that she almost deleted but ultimately left in. "The one called Park is afraid. I can see it in him every moment of every hour, and he is still here. I do not know what to make of this." 3 days after the humans arrived, the long-range sensor arrays detected the Vrexol 3rd Expansion Fleet dropping out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system. 15,000 warships, carrying enough ground troops to darken the sky of any world they chose to descend upon. The fleet would reach Shelkar VII in 72 hours. Nithra ran to the command post to deliver the report and found Herrera already there, reading the sensor data with the expression of a man who has seen bad news before and has learned that the only useful response is to start making plans. "Where are the Reapers?" Nithra asked, though she already knew the answer. "Pinned down 3 systems away," Herrera said. "They cannot reach us in time." "Then what do we have?" Herrera looked at her, and the lines around his eyes deepened in what might have been a smile or might have been something else entirely. "You have us," he said. Nithra looked out the command post window at the 40,000 unaugmented humans digging trenches and stacking supplies and checking weapons, and telling jokes and eating food that burned their own mouths and sleeping when their bodies demanded it, and being afraid and being brave and being completely and utterly ordinary. And she thought, this is all we have. This is all we have. The sky above Shelkar VII turned the color of a bruise at 1400 hours on the third day, and then the Vrexel came down through the clouds like a plague given form and purpose. The planetary shields held for about 90 minutes before the sheer concentrated fury of 15,000 warships found the cracks and punched through. And after that the orbital bombardment began in earnest, great columns of fire slamming into the surface and turning defensive positions into craters and craters into deeper craters. Nithra was in the forward command bunker when the first drop pods hit the ground less than 2 kilometers from the perimeter, and the sound they made was something between thunder and the scream of metal being torn apart by hands that did not care about metal. The Vrexel emerged from their pods, and Nithra saw them clearly for the first time through the bunker's observation feeds, and every prey animal instinct that 200,000 years of Paleshi evolution had built into her body told her to run. They were enormous, 8-limbed nightmares covered in chitinous armor that looked like it had been grown rather than manufactured, each one standing nearly 3 meters tall with forelimbs that ended in serrated blades of bone and mineral composite. They moved in perfect coordination, not as individuals but as extensions of a single vast intelligence, the hive signal linking them together into an organism that thought with 1,000 brains and struck with 1,000 limbs. The Paleshi defensive lines on the eastern perimeter broke within the first hour. Nithra listened to the communications and heard the panic in the voices of her own people, as the Vrexel pushed through positions that had been fortified for weeks as though they were made of paper. And then she heard something else on the communications network, a human voice, calm and rough like gravel, cutting through the chaos with 3 words. "Hold the line." It was Herrera. Mwanga's squad was dug into a forward position on the western perimeter, and the Vrexel hit them 20 minutes after the first drop pods landed, a wave of chitinous bodies crashing against the human trenches like an ocean made of blades and fury. Nithra watched the feeds and waited for the line to break the way the Paleshi lines had broken, waited for these soft, unaugmented humans to crumble against an enemy that had devoured entire civilizations. The line did not break. It bent badly. There were moments when it looked like a single strong push would shatter it into fragments, but it did not break. Herrera moved through the chaos like a man walking through a storm he had seen before, not the same storm exactly, but close enough that the principles still applied. He did not have precognitive implants telling him where the next attack would come. He had 16 years of experience and an instinct for violence that no amount of engineering could replicate because it had been earned one terrible day at a time. "Keep your head down," he told his squad. "Keep shooting and keep your buddy alive, everything else is details." The Vrexel hit the line again, and a warrior, one of the big ones, a command-cast unit with reinforced chitin and blade arms that could cut through standard armor, drove straight into the trench and impaled Private Kovacs through the left shoulder. Kovacs screamed, and it was not a controlled tactical vocalization or a regulated pain response. It was the raw animal sound of a human being who had just been stabbed through the body by something from a nightmare. And then Kovacs did something that the Vrexel warrior was not prepared for. He kept fighting. His left arm was useless, pinned and bleeding, and he brought his rifle up with his right hand and fired point-blank into the Vrexel's face and kept firing as adrenaline, that ancient unengineered chemical that human bodies have been producing since before they climbed down from the trees, flooded his system and turned pain into fuel. The Vrexel warrior hesitated. It was only a moment, a fraction of a second of confusion in the hive signal, but Nithra caught it on the observation feed, and she understood what it meant. The Vrexel had fought enhanced humans before, and they had models for that, Optimized beings followed optimal patterns, and optimal patterns could be predicted and countered. But their model said that a creature with that level of tissue damage should stop functioning, should collapse, should surrender to the mathematics of injury. Kovacs had not read those models, and his body was running on something older and more stubborn than mathematics. A medic dragged Kovacs back from the line, and he was still trying to fire his rifle with one hand as they pulled him into the aid station. 300 meters south, Mwanga's fire team got cut off from the main line when a Vrexel flanking force collapsed the connecting trench. They were 4 humans in a hole in the ground with enemies on 3 sides and no communication with command, and every tactical manual ever written said they should fall back to the secondary position and regroup. Mwangi looked around. There was a partially destroyed building on the Vrexel approach route, a Paleshi storage facility that had taken a hit from the orbital bombardment and was leaning at an angle that suggested it was one strong push away from coming down entirely. Mwanga's fire team had demolition charges, small ones, meant for clearing rubble and opening blocked passages, not for combat. No tactical AI told them what to do. No enhanced cognitive implant ran the calculations. Mwangi looked at the building and looked at the Vrexel column moving through the street below it and said, "I have a terrible idea," and her fire team, because they were human and humans have a documented weakness for terrible ideas that might work, said "Do it." They placed the charges and blew the building onto the Vrexel column and killed or disabled 37 enemy combatants in 4 seconds with a weapon that was not a weapon used in a way that no manual had ever described. Nithra stared at the feed and added a note to her tactical record that simply said they improvised. On the northern section of the perimeter, Herrera found himself in a crater with 3 wounded Paleshi soldiers. The Paleshi militia had been fighting alongside the humans and taking casualties, and these 3 were too injured to move on their own. Broken limbs, internal bleeding, the kind of damage that meant death if they did not reach the aid station within the hour. The aid station was 200 meters away across open ground that was being swept by Vrexel ranged fire. Herrera weighed approximately 90 kilograms. Each Paleshi weighed approximately 40. He could carry one at a time. He picked up the first Paleshi and ran. Nithra watched on the feed as this unaugmented, unenhanced, completely ordinary human being sprinted across open ground with a wounded alien soldier on his back, while energy bolts tore up the dirt around his feet. He reached the aid station and put the Paleshi down and turned around and ran back. He was hit in the leg on the second trip, a glancing shot that burned through his armor and scored the flesh underneath, and he stumbled and caught himself and kept running with the second Paleshi on his back. He made it to the aid station and put the second one down, and the medic told him to stop, and he turned around and ran back a third time. He was hit again on the third trip, this time in the side, a wound that would require surgery and weeks of recovery, and he did not stop. 3 trips across open ground under enemy fire, carrying creatures that were not his species, bleeding from 2 wounds, operating on nothing but his own decision that these 3 beings were going to live. The Paleshi medic at the aid station looked at Herrera after the third trip and said, "Why?" And Herrera said, "Because they were there and I could carry them." As if it was that simple. As if it was the most obvious thing in the world. On the far eastern edge of the perimeter, where the line was thinnest, Private Park was alone in a foxhole. His fire team had been pulled to reinforce a breach 200 meters north, and he had been left to hold the position until they returned, and then the communications went down and they did not return. He was 20 years old and he was afraid. He had been afraid since the day he shipped out from Earth, and he had been afraid every single day on Shelkar VII, and he was afraid now in a way that went beyond thought into something physical, a shaking in his hands, and a tightness in his chest that made every breath feel like a negotiation. A Vrexel scout found him. It came over the edge of the foxhole in a rush of chitin and blades, and Park did not have time to raise his rifle, so he grabbed the entrenching tool that was lying beside him, a small folding shovel, a piece of equipment designed for digging holes, not fighting monsters, and he swung it. He hit the Vrexel in the joint between its head and thorax, the one weak point in the chitin armor, and he hit it again and again until it stopped moving. Then he sat down in the foxhole next to the dead alien and vomited. Then he wiped his mouth and picked up his rifle and moved to the next position because the line still needed holding, and he was the only one there to hold it. The first wave ended 6 hours after it began. The Vrexel pulled back to regroup, and the defenders, human and Paleshi alike, took stock of what remained. The humans had lost 4,000 soldiers in those 6 hours. 4,000 people who had been alive that morning, who had eaten breakfast and checked their gear, and maybe looked at pictures of dogs taped inside their helmets. Nithra walked through the human section of the camp that evening and saw something she had never expected to see. The humans were crying. They were sitting among their dead, and they were weeping openly, loudly, without shame, holding the hands of friends who would never hold back and speaking to bodies that would never answer. Nithra had never seen a reaper cry. She was not certain reapers could cry. The chemical regulators probably prevented it, stripped away the response the same way they stripped away fear and fatigue, and all the other things that made a person a person. These humans wept for their dead, and then they stood up and wiped their faces and began reloading their weapons for the next wave. Nithra updated her report that night with hands that were shaking for reasons she did not fully understand. "I was wrong about them," she wrote. "The special forces are weapons, precise and terrible and built for a purpose. These people are something else. I do not yet have a word for it, but I am looking." 800 light-years away, in the command core of the Vrexel 3rd Expansion Fleet, the Dominion commander reviewed the battle data from the first wave and flagged an anomaly. The enhanced humans had been predicted and accounted for in every tactical model. These unenhanced ones had not. They were adapting faster than the models allowed, fighting in patterns that no optimization algorithm would produce, taking damage that should have ended their combat effectiveness, and somehow continuing to function. The commander sent a query to the Dominion Strategic Intelligence Network, a question that rippled through the hive signal like a stone dropped into still water. "What are these?" The network searched its databases and found no satisfactory answer. The commander looked at the battle data again, and for the first time in its existence, felt something it did not have a name for, something that in a less disciplined mind might have been called unease. By the 3rd day of the siege, the world had become a landscape of mud and fire and noise that never stopped, and the humans were still there. Nithra had stopped filing formal reports because there was no time, and because she had realized that no report could capture what she was witnessing, that the act of reducing these humans to data points and tactical assessments was a kind of lie, a way of making them smaller than they actually were. The Vrexel had landed reinforcements on the 2nd day, tens of thousands of fresh warriors pouring down from orbit to replace the ones the defenders had killed. And the situation on Shelkar VII had gone from desperate to something beyond desperate, something for which the Paleshi language did not have an adequate word. No relief fleet was coming. The nearest conquered naval force was 12 days out, and Commander Oren's Reapers were still pinned down 3 systems away, fighting their own battle. The humans knew this. They all knew this. Every soldier on that line understood that there was no rescue coming, and that the only thing standing between the Vrexel and the total consumption of Shelkar VII was them. 40,000 minus 4,000 ordinary people from a planet called Earth who had no business being alive against these odds, and who refused to accept that. They dug in deeper. Nithra observed, and she documented not with official reports now, but with her own memory, burning every detail into her mind, because she had become convinced that someone needed to remember this even if no one survived to read about it. On the fourth day, a Vrexel tunneling force breached the underground section of the eastern perimeter, punching through the rock beneath the defensive line and pouring into the sub-level corridors that connected the supply depots and medical stations. The breach threatened to collapse the entire eastern defense, and there was no combat unit close enough to respond in time. A logistics sergeant named Rivera, a woman who had been a plumber on Earth before enlisting, who had spent her military career managing water purification systems and sewage recycling units, and had never fired her weapon outside of basic training qualification, looked at the breach on her tactical display, and then looked at the base's water recycling system. The water recycler heated its cleaning fluid to 200 degrees to sterilize it before redistribution. Rivera rerouted the system's output pipes to the breach corridor and opened the valves. Superheated steam flooded the tunnel at pressure levels that would strip paint from metal, and the Vrexel tunneling force, adapted to the cold, vacuum-adjacent temperatures of space travel, died screaming in a language the translators could not process. Rivera closed the valves and rerouted the system back to its normal function, and went back to managing the water supply, as though she had not just committed an act of devastating tactical improvisation using plumbing. Nithra added this to her memory and thought about what it meant, that this species did not just produce warriors, it produced people who could become warriors out of whatever they happened to be holding at the time. On the fifth night, the bombardment was particularly heavy, and the humans were in their trenches and bunkers and foxholes waiting for the next ground assault, and someone started singing. Nithra did not know the song. Her translator provided the words but not the meaning, because the meaning of a song is not in its words, but in the act of singing it, in the vibration of air pushed out of fragile human lungs into the darkness between explosions. One voice became 2 and then 10 and then 100, spreading along the trench line like a signal fire, and the Paleshi soldiers crouched beside them did not understand what was happening, but they felt it. Nithra felt it. It was not a war song or a battle hymn. It was something soft and slow and achingly sad, a melody about a home that might no longer exist being sung by people who might never see home again, and it was the most terrifying thing Nithra had ever heard. Not because of what it said, but because of what it meant, that these people could sit in the mud in the dark with death falling from the sky and choose to make something beautiful, that the impulse to create and connect and reach out to each other was so deep in them that even the end of the world could not burn it out. Nithra caught herself humming the melody hours later, and stopped and stared at her own hands as though they belonged to someone else. Herrera had been awake for 46 hours by the 6th day. A Paleshi medic, one of the ones he had carried across open ground, now recovered enough to work, ran a diagnostic scan on him, and told him that his cortisol levels indicated he should be unconscious, that his body was operating so far beyond its design parameters that the medic's equipment kept flagging him as critical, even though he was standing upright and speaking coherently. Herrera reached into his pack and pulled out a small packet of brown powder and mixed it with hot water and drank it. "What is that?" the medic asked. "Instant coffee," Herrera said. "What does it do?" "It keeps me vertical." "Your body needs sleep. You are damaging yourself by continuing to operate." Herrera looked at the medic, and there was something in his eyes that was not anger or defiance but something quieter and more immovable, the expression of a man who has weighed his own well-being against the lives of the people depending on him, and made a choice that no chemical regulator forced him to make. "I will sleep when this is over," he said, and went back to the line. On the 6th day, the Vrexel changed tactics. They had captured a group of Paleshi civilians, refugees from a settlement that had been overrun during the initial bombardment, and they executed them within visual range of the human defensive positions. It was a terror tactic, a calculated act designed to break morale, to show the defenders that resistance was futile, and that the Vrexel could reach the people they were trying to protect. The Vrexel tactical models predicted that this would cause demoralization, hesitation, a measurable decrease in combat effectiveness as the defenders confronted the reality of their failure to protect the innocent. The models were wrong. The human response was immediate. It was not ordered. No commander gave the signal. No tactical plan was consulted. It erupted from the line like a detonation, a wave of pure fury that translated itself into coordinated violence with a speed that caught even Nithra off guard. A counterattack launched within the hour, technically disorganized, driven not by strategy but by rage, by the particular human capacity to transform grief and horror into forward momentum. The Vrexel had no framework for this. Every species they had consumed had responded to terror tactics the same way, with fear, with paralysis, with the slow collapse of the will to fight. These humans did the opposite. They fought harder, moved faster, hit with a ferocity that exceeded anything the tactical models had predicted, because the models did not account for anger as a fuel source. The counterattack retook 300 meters of lost ground in 90 minutes and killed more Vrexel than any single engagement since the siege began. Mwangi was promoted to sergeant in the field on the 6th day after her lieutenant was killed by a Vrexel sniper. She did not feel ready for the rank. She said so to Herrera when he pinned the insignia on her armor, and he said, "Nobody ever does, that is not the point. The point is you are here and they need you." She held her section for 3 days after that, making decisions that would determine who lived and who died among the soldiers who looked to her for guidance, carrying a weight that no physical augmentation could help with because it was not a weight of the body but of the soul. She lost friends, people she had trained with and laughed with and shared meals with, and at night when the fighting paused, she wrote letters on her datapad that she could not send because the communications satellites had been destroyed. Letters to her brother in Mombasa telling him she was fine, telling him she loved him, telling him to take care of Mama if she did not come back. She never sent them, but she kept writing them because the act of writing was a way of staying human in a place that was trying very hard to strip that away. Park had stopped being visibly afraid somewhere around the 4th day, and Nithra noticed and asked him what had changed. He was sitting on an ammunition crate, cleaning his rifle with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has performed the same action 1,000 times, and his hands were steady now, in a way they had not been when he first arrived. "I am still scared," he said without looking up. "I just got used to it." Nithra considered this and realized it might be the most human thing anyone had ever said to her. Not that the fear was gone, but that he had learned to carry it, to fold it into himself and keep moving, to treat terror as a companion rather than a master. In the command corps of the Vrexel fleet, the Dominion commander was doing something it had never done before. It was revising its models in real time, not because new data had invalidated the old predictions, but because the fundamental assumptions underlying those predictions had turned out to be wrong. The enhanced humans were predictable. They followed optimized patterns because they were optimized beings, and optimized beings converged on optimal solutions. These unaugmented ones were chaotic. They did things that should not work, and then those things worked. They took losses that should shatter unit cohesion, and instead became more cohesive, drawing together in the fire like metal being forged rather than broken. One of the Dominion sub-commanders sent a report that the translation systems rendered into Concord standard as follows. "They are not soldiers in any way we understand the term. They do not optimize. They do not follow predictable patterns. They improvise and adapt and refuse and endure. They are not a military force. They are a phenomenon. The commander read this and made its decision. On the seventh day it would commit everything. Every reserve unit, every support element, every warrior the fleet could put on the ground, to one massive final assault designed to shatter the human line through sheer, overwhelming force. It would end this. Simultaneously, a transmission reached the defenders on Shelkar VII, weak and distorted by the Vrexel jamming but clear enough to understand. Commander Oren's Reapers had broken free of their engagement 3 systems away and were burning hard for Shelkar VII at maximum speed. Estimated time of arrival, 9 hours. The humans needed to hold until dawn. Herrera heard the transmission and looked at Mwangi, and Mwangi looked at Park, and Park looked at the picture of his dog taped inside his helmet. 9 hours, Mwangi said. 9 hours, Herrera confirmed. Park closed his helmet and picked up his rifle and said nothing because there was nothing to say that the 3 of them did not already know. They would hold or they would die, and there was no third option, and they had made their peace with that arithmetic days ago. Nithra watched them prepare and she felt something shift inside her, a tectonic movement in the landscape of her understanding, and she thought, I came here expecting weapons and I found something else, something I still do not have a word for, but I am closer now. I am so close. The last night on Shelkar VII began with the sky catching fire. The Vrexel committed everything, every warrior, every war beast, every siege engine and tunneling machine and airborne assault platform they had, and the ground itself seemed to groan under the weight of what was coming. A tide of chitin and blades and hive-driven fury that stretched from horizon to horizon like the end of the world wearing armor. The defensive line buckled in the first 30 minutes. The eastern perimeter collapsed entirely when 3 Vrexel siege engines punched through the wall simultaneously and poured warriors into the gap like water through a broken dam. And for a span of about 4 minutes, the entire defense of Shelkar VII existed in a state between holding and falling that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff in a windstorm. Then the humans reformed the line. Not in the same place. They could not hold the original position, but 200 meters back, in a ragged crescent of hastily dug foxholes and overturned vehicles and chunks of debris, arranged into something that was not a fortification by any military definition, but was close enough to die behind. And they did die behind it. Humans fell in numbers that would have broken any species the Vrexel had ever encountered, losses that accumulated minute by minute like sand filling an hourglass. But the ones who were still standing kept fighting with a fury that had gone beyond anger into something primal and absolute. The Paleshi fought beside them. This was something Nithra had not expected, and it filled her with an emotion so large she could not contain it. Her own people, the small 6-eyed herbivores who had spent their entire evolutionary history running from predators, standing in the fire next to humans and fighting back. The humans had taught them that, not through orders or training but through example, through the simple devastating demonstration that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to stand up anyway. Herrera took a critical wound at the command post 3 hours into the final assault. A Vrexel breaching team hit the position and Herrera threw himself between the attackers and the communication equipment. That was their only link to the incoming Reapers. Absorbing a blade strike across his torso that opened his armor like paper and the flesh beneath it like something worse. He killed the Vrexel that struck him, killed it with his sidearm at contact range, while his other hand held his own body together. And then he sat down against the wall because his legs had decided they were finished cooperating. The medics reached him and started working, and he grabbed Mwanga's arm as they carried him past, and his grip was still strong, still the grip of a man who had spent 16 years refusing to let go of things. "You have got this, Sergeant," he said, and his voice was quieter now but no less certain. "You have had it the whole time." Mwangi looked at him, and there were tears on her face, but her jaw was set, and her eyes were clear, and she nodded once and turned back to the line. She had 26 soldiers left from what had been a company of 160, and she had a collapsed section of the perimeter that needed to be retaken, or the entire western defense would fold inward like a crushed can. She did not have a tactical AI to calculate the optimal approach. She did not have enhanced reflexes or predictive implants or chemical courage, pumped into her bloodstream by machines. She had 26 exhausted, bleeding, terrified human beings and a squad of Paleshi militia who had learned to trust the species that bled beside them. "We go now," she said. "Together, stay close and keep moving and do not stop for anything." They charged. It was not elegant. It was not the precise surgical violence of the Reapers or the coordinated swarm tactics of the Vrexel. It was ugly and desperate and loud, a knot of screaming humans and Paleshi crashing into the Vrexel line with weapons and fists and fury, and the sheer bloody-minded refusal to die quietly. They retook the section. They held it. On the far side of the perimeter, in a chokepoint between two collapsed buildings that was the only approach to the medical station, where 300 wounded soldiers and civilians were sheltering, Private Park stood alone. His fire team was down, not dead, he hoped, but unconscious or too wounded to fight, and the chokepoint was the only thing between the Vrexel and the wounded, and someone had to hold it. Park was 20 years old, and he had a picture of a dog named Biscuit in his helmet, and he had been afraid every single day since he left Earth, and he was afraid now in a way that went all the way down to the base of his spine, and lived there like a cold fire. He held the chokepoint for 40 minutes. 40 minutes alone in a gap between broken walls, firing and reloading and firing again, changing positions when the Vrexel tried to flank him, using grenades when they bunched up and his entrenching tool when they got close enough to touch. He was not a super soldier. He was not augmented or enhanced or optimized. He was a 20-year-old kid who loved his dog and missed his family, and had joined the military because he did not know what else to do with his life. And he held that chokepoint for 40 minutes because the people behind him could not hold it themselves. When the relief squad finally reached him, they found him sitting among the Vrexel dead, reloading magazines with hands that shook so badly he kept dropping the rounds, and he looked up at them with eyes that had seen too much for anyone his age and said, "Is it morning yet?" It was not morning yet, but it was close. The sky had begun to lighten at the edges, not the natural dawn of Shelkar VII's sun, but something brighter and sharper, points of light descending through the atmosphere like falling stars in reverse. The Reapers. Commander Oren's 9th Special Operations Group dropped from orbit in assault pods that hit the Vrexel rear lines like the fist of a god. 400 enhanced super soldiers slamming into the enemy from above with the kind of precise, devastating violence that they had been engineered to deliver. The Vrexel fleet, caught between the entrenched defenders who would not break and the special forces tearing through their rear, began to fracture, the hive signal stuttering as coordination nodes were destroyed faster than they could be replaced, individual units losing cohesion and falling back, and then running. The Dominion commander ordered a retreat, a full withdrawal, the first in the 3rd Expansion Fleet's history, and the Vrexel pulled away from Shelkar VII like a tide going out, leaving behind their dead and the wreckage of their certainty that this world would be easy to consume. Dawn broke. Real dawn, Shelkar VII's pale blue sun rising over a landscape that looked like the surface of a wound. And in that light, the survivors stood and sat and lay among the ruins of what they had held and looked at each other with the stunned disbelief of people who had expected to die and had not. Commander Oren walked the battlefield in the hours that followed. She moved through the wreckage of the human defensive positions, and she saw things that no tactical briefing could have prepared her for, the improvised fortifications built from debris and willpower, the the jury-rigged weapons made from repurposed equipment, the patchwork defensive line that had held against a force that should have overwhelmed it 10 times over, held together not by technology or augmentation, but by something older and less quantifiable. She saw a regular Marine, a young woman with a bandaged arm and hollow eyes, carrying a wounded Paleshi on her back toward the medical station, moving with the slow, determined gait of someone who had decided that this was what she was going to do, and nothing in the universe was going to stop her. She saw the graves, rows of them, dug in the brief pauses between assaults, marked with helmets and rifles, and sometimes just a name scratched into the dirt with a knife. Oren found Mwangi sitting on a pile of rubble near the western perimeter. The newly made sergeant looked like she had been dragged through the underworld and back. No augmentations, no implants, running on caffeine and whatever stubborn fire burned at the center of her and refusing to go out, covered in dust and blood that was partly hers and partly not. Oren was the most dangerous human alive, a weapon honed to perfection, optimized and enhanced beyond what nature had intended, capable of feats that most species considered impossible. She looked at this ordinary, exhausted young woman from Mombasa, who had held a line she should not have been able to hold, and she said quietly, "Hell of a job, Sergeant." Mwangi looked up at her and almost smiled. 1,200 light-years away, on Valith Prime, Scribe Adjutant Korev received Nithra's final field report from Shelkar VII. He read it alone first, in his quarters with all 6 eyes, and when he was finished he sat in silence for a long time. Then he brought it to the Defense Committee. The chamber was full, every delegation that had been present at the original summit, and a dozen more besides, drawn by the news of what had happened on Shelkar VII, by the reports that were already spreading through the Concord like a signal fire, jumping from hilltop to hilltop. Korev stood at the center of the chamber where Commander Oren had stood weeks ago, and he read Nithra's report aloud. He read about the plumber who had killed a tunneling force with a water recycler. He read about the sergeant who carried wounded aliens across open ground under fire because they were there and I could carry them. He read about the humans who sang in the darkness between bombardments. He read about the young soldier who held a chokepoint alone for 40 minutes and asked, "Is it morning yet?" when it was over. He read about the counterattack fueled by rage and grief that retook 300 meters in 90 minutes. He read about the humans who wept for their dead and then stood up and reloaded their weapons. He read about the fear, the constant, ever-present fear that the unaugmented humans carried with them every moment, and how they fought through it not because they could not feel it, but because they had decided that the people beside them mattered more than their own terror. The chamber was silent when he finished. Ambassador Tyvelk the Rithani spoke first. "The special forces we understood," he said slowly, his antennae still for the first time Korev could remember. "They were engineered to be formidable. They were designed and built and optimized for exactly what they do, these others, these regulars. What are they?" Korev looked down at the last page of Nithra's report, the part she had marked as personal addendum, not official record, and he read it aloud. "I asked Corporal Mwangi, Sergeant Mwangi now, what makes them fight like this without the augmentations, without the enhancements, without the engineering?" She looked at me as though the question made no sense. She said, "This is what humans do, we look after each other." Korev paused and then read the final lines. "The word I was looking for, Adjutant, is not soldier or warrior or weapon. The word is human. That is what they are, that is all they have ever needed to be." The chamber remained silent, and Korev closed the report and set it down and did something that a scribe adjutant was never supposed to do. He added a personal annotation to the official record of the Galactic Concord. He picked up his stylus and wrote in a hand that was steady despite the trembling he felt in every part of his body. amended to the official record of the siege of Shelkar VII. We feared what humanity built. We should have feared what humanity already was. He set down the stylus and looked up at the assembled delegates of 4,000 species, and none of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say. Somewhere on Shelkar VII, in the pale blue light of a morning that had cost 30,000 lives to reach, Sergeant Danielle Mwangi sat in the ruins and opened her datapad, and finally wrote a letter she could send. Dear Quame, we made it to morning. I am coming home. Tell Mama I love her. Tell her we looked after each other. That is what we do. She hit send and closed her eyes and let the sun touch her face, and for the first time in 7 days she was not afraid.